actually the only way you can compete is by having larger and larger capitals, because you need to be able to buy more raw materials to keep the work process going, and you also need to buy the fixed capital in order to enjoy the factory system. Okay, so as I said, I actually think this is very, very important and often overlooked, that within volume 1 of Capital is a load of, it's really tedious to read, to be honest, but then you have to do it, don't you? Really, a lot of volume 1 of Capital is about the narrow way in which capitalism gets to produce the surplus which feeds the profits and other revenue that's appropriated by those who own directly or indirectly the means of production. So far, so good? Okay. What Marx also does in volume 1 of Capital is to ask, what are the consequences? What are the consequences of the fact that this is the way in which capitalism develops, through accumulation, through productivity increase, and so on? And he comes up with a number of remarkable conclusions. The first is, capitalism has a tendency towards monopolization. Everyone remembers this when Marx is in favour. Oh, Marx was predicting the formation of large corporations almost 200 years ago, well, 150 years ago. Why? That's sort of obvious why, according to his theory. Why would you get large corporations dominating the production process or the economy? Because accumulation of capital is one in which the big producers beat out the small producers. Monopolization of this sort is itself associated with, again, something we can see very, very clearly across the world, both within countries and between countries, is what is called combined and uneven development. A large conglomeration of production takes place and economic development in some places at the expense of others, because where productivity increases the most, it outcompetes others and they go into decline. Marx also predicts the necessity of unemployment under capitalism. Why? Because this process of accumulation will from time to time throw people out of work as factories are closed and concentrated on larger factories elsewhere. Also, that unemployment is necessary, according to Marx, so that where accumulation does take place, there's a pool of workers who can be absorbed into production. So he sees unemployment not as an equilibrium level, but as a pool into which the unemployed and the employed are continuously coming in and out. In terms of, the last thing I want to say really summarizes in 3 minutes, maybe 500 pages of what Marx has to say about the capitalist economy. And this is as follows. This is really what Volume 2 and Volume 3 is about. What Marx argues is that I've told you what the laws of production of capitalism are. This is the way that capitalism develops. At the core, that doesn't mean there aren't exceptions to it, but this is the systematic way in which capitalism develops. And I think this stands up very, very well to any sort of empirical or historical analysis. But then Marx asks a question about what are the consequences of this over and above the things that I've mentioned. And there'll be another one which I will come to in a minute. And his answer is, well, these developments within production, as is very clear from what we've said already, monopolization, combined and uneven development, unemployment, and so on, creation of enormous divides between one set of communities and another, or different geographical locations. What Marx argues is that these are huge economic and social tensions which are created. But what are the ways of resolving these tensions as accumulation continues to occur? And his answer is, well, the only mechanism, or the main mechanism for coordinating all of these processes is not an equilibrium set of prices in general equilibrium. It is the market mechanism. The market mechanism has to coordinate this anarchic set of economic and social developments that have taken place. And his answer is, yes, capitalism can do it. Marx is not someone who says capitalism is permanently in crisis, and so on. What he's arguing is, yes, capitalism can, market system can coordinate these tensions, but from time to time, they will give rise to a crisis. And it can be a crisis within the economy, it can be a crisis between the economic forces and the social mechanisms which are associated with that, and so on. So really, as I said, I can only do it in 3 minutes. What Marx is arguing is that it's the nature of the capitalist economy that it should suffer crisis from time to time because it keeps on intensifying the strains that are placed upon the economic and social system in ways which are difficult to predict, but for which major reliance is placed upon the market to coordinate those outcomes. Okay, so far so good. What I wanted to do next, I don't know how much longer I should go on for, what I wanted to do next was to talk about today's crisis. Again, another factor that might be thought to have brought us together. And not only today's crisis, but an apparently irresolvable recession. I mean, let's put aside the pathetic response of mainstream economic, I mean, I shouldn't just call names and so on, but they actually say it themselves in many ways. Those who are even prepared to address this issue. So what I want to talk about is what sort of light can Marxist political economy shed upon today's crisis and irresolvable recession. I certainly think other versions of heterodox economics or political economy have much to say about this as well. Perhaps that will become apparent. But I want to start with one particular proposition which I think is crucial for understanding what is going on in the big scheme of things. And this might come as a bit of a surprise to you. But once I put the proposition to you, I hope you'll agree with me. And that is, capitalism has never had it so good. Conditions for capitalism couldn't have been more favourable. Why do I say? I mean, we're in the midst of a crisis, the worst since the 1930s, a recession we can't get out of. Why do I say that capitalism has never had it so good? Well, let's have a look. Let's have a look and see what's going on. Let's have a look at what have been the conditions, from a Marxist point of view, for the accumulation of capital, for the economy to grow, be successful, and so on. Okay? And the first thing that I always refer to is that what we've experienced over the last 30 or 40 years, possibly longer, certainly over the last 20 years, is a quite extraordinary and unprecedented number of, or sequences of technological innovations. New products, new processes, and so on. These didn't exist when I remember when the first one came into our department, everyone laughed at this. Actually, it was bigger than this. The word processor was bigger than this, had disks this size and so on. But you know, we all know that there's been a revolution in IT technology, biotechnology, etc., new materials, etc., etc. Okay, so I would argue that there's been quite an extraordinary and unprecedented degree of technological innovation, which really ought to have been able to fuel huge increases in productivity and highly favourable for capital accumulation. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that there's been this unprecedented increase in the world labour market. I mean, the most obvious example is the joining of China into the capitalist world, if you like, but also over a longer period we've had the entry of married women into the labour force and so on. So, you know, we've had an extraordinary increase in the global level of labour supply. So technological information, labour supply. We've also had a quite extraordinary decline in the power, strength of organised working class, partly through deindustrialisation, but through other reasons as well. You know, organised working class on a global level, and indeed in individual natures, in individual countries, is weaker than it's ever been before, or have been for some time. Let's have a look at the decolonisation movement. Now, it's over, it's finished. You know, Third World liberation, radical opposition to capitalism, the Cold War, it's over. neoliberalism is triumphant. So, and in the same, it's also the case that given the balance of power between capital and labour in individual countries and across the world, the triumph of neoliberalism, the triumph of the US in the Cold War, the end of decolonisation, moderation in wages. In the United States, real wages have been stagnant. The level of real wages has been stagnant for the last 30 years. And the percentage income of the top 1% from the mid-1960s has gone from under 8% to over 23%. Okay, it's an extraordinary increase in inequality. So, and that's all explained by what I'll be coming on to fairly soon. But putting all of this together, right? Putting all of this together, technology, labour supply, balance of class forces, stagnation in real wages, or very low increase in real wages, stagnation, or certainly not huge increases in what's called the social wage, associated with neoliberalism. There's not been massive increases. So actually, for the first time in my memory at least, or possibly for the first time in history, there's been this huge crisis, and no one is blaming the wage or the social wage. They can't. They can't. So, but I'm putting this much stronger than this. What I'm saying is, capitalism never had it so good. It reminds me actually, sorry, it's just you and me again, John, I suspect. It reminds me of Ted Heath in the 1970s when he said to the British capitalists, you know, I've contained wages, I've cut state expenditure, I've reduced the interest rate, and still you won't invest, right? Same thing today, you know, but across the world. Nothing, the conditions couldn't have been more favourable to capitalism than they are today, across those and all the other conditions I mentioned. And yet, I'm being recorded, aren't I? They fucked it up. I mean, they completely and absolutely fucked it up, haven't they? Not only things, no, I mean, what do they want? What do they want? Yeah? If they told us what they wanted, we could give it to them, couldn't we? And we could get them, but no.
They want to be in the office.
What?
They want to stay in the office.
They want to stay in the office.
Especially politicians.
Well, that's not new. And the answer, I think, is fairly obvious. The answer, we all know what the answer is. It's finance. Okay? It's finance. And what I want to argue now, or suggest to you, is that Marx, and this comes in the later volumes of Capital, has a very, very sophisticated theory of finance. And I'm going to give you just a few hints of what that is. First of all, Marx distinguishes between credit in general and what we might call credit as capital. What we mean by credit in general is actually I bought my train ticket to come here. Right? It's been refunded, I think. So that's just credit. You know, no one's trying to make a profit out of the use of this money. And credit's very, very important, but it precedes capitalism. Credit has long since existed. So credit is just borrowing and lending, without necessarily the notion of trying to make a profit. Got the idea? Marx pointed to something different, and I think he's unique in this. In fact, Keynes and other writers have said this is a very good point in Marx's work. Marx then goes on to say, but there's credit of a different type under capitalism, and that credit is borrowing in order to make a profit. And that's different, because if I borrow in order to make a profit, then I don't just pay you back, I have to engage in the process of production or something else in order to generate the returns that I can give to you, as well as to make a profit for myself. So for Marx, there's a very, very significant distinction between just credit as borrowing and lending, as opposed to credit as a way of expanding your capital. That's the first thing. In fact, it's something I should have mentioned when I talked about the dynamics of capitalism for Marx and the economic and social consequences. What Marx argues in Volume 1 of Capital is that one of the consequences of capitalism is the creation of a sophisticated credit system. Because in order to accumulate capital, I can't form Microsoft on the basis of my own capital alone. I have to borrow and put to use the capital that's available from everyone. So this is what a credit system is under capitalism. It's not just borrowing and lending, it's gathering capital for accumulation in concentrated hands. Okay, so what happens, according to Marx, is the way in which capitalists compete, and in many ways the strongest capitalists will be those who have the best access to credit. Okay. But then what that creates is an entitlement. If I lend you some money, I have an entitlement for you to pay me back. But if I lend you some money and you have to produce something, make a profit, and then pay me back, then my being paid back is contingent upon your undertaking that profitable activity. You got the idea? And what Marx argues is that this creates something called fictitious capital, because I have now as the lender, an entitlement to a future profit. But I might not want to wait for that profit. I might want to sell on my claim to that profit to somebody else. So, this credit as capital is something which then begins to circulate independently of what is producing the surplus to pay back. Can you see the point? I mean, everyone knows this. This is what speculation is, that there is a distinction. There's a distinction between the asset as a piece of paper and the asset as a set of economic relations that are going on, producing the surplus to warrant the value of that asset. Got the idea? And this is what Marx calls fictitious capital. Not because it doesn't exist, but because it could be, I mean, if there was corruption or so on, or embezzlement, or whatever, or dishonesty, he could actually be running off with that money and have no intention to pay me back at all, and that would certainly be fictitious capital. But for Marx, the fictitious capital isn't because there isn't an asset there. It's fictitious because the asset representing that claim on the future, can circulate independently, can be bought and sold independently of.
I just want to ask, in today's terms, what you were talking about.
I'll tell you in a minute.
The bond, or actually the finance future.
I'll get to that in a minute, possibly. So you can ask your question again later. So, almost there. So Marx makes this very, very important distinction between credit as credit and credit as capital, and then relationship between that and fictitious capital. Okay, what's the relevance of this? What's the relevance of this to the modern world? And here I want to introduce a concept which has been used by Marxist political economy, but by heterodox economists as well. And that is the notion of financialization. I don't know if any of you have come across this. And the idea of financialization is to point to the increasing significance of finance in modern capitalism over the last 30 or 40 years. Now, there are two big things to say about financialization as a concept. First of all, there are huge differences within heterodox political economy about this. I have my own particular view about how it should be understood. Others have different views. Right? That's the first thing to say. I'm going to give you my view. I won't give you others unless you ask me. The other thing to say about it is financialization cannot appear in mainstream economics. Financialization is about the systemic global properties of what has been going on over the last 30 years. It's not about the optimization of individuals in their speculative behavior. Okay? And what I want to do, there are many, I actually found one article which has 17 different definitions of financialization. But I want to give you just one very, very clear indicator of financialization. And this is that the ratio of financial assets to global GDP, global financial assets to global GDP, over the last 30 years has increased by 3 times. And this is because, of course, I don't know if this is what you're on about, the proliferation of many, many different types of financial assets. I have my favourite. What's my favourite? John will like this. My favourite is futures trading, futures carbon trading, right? Which is trading in the future of not producing. In fact, you are going to, but trading in the futures of trading on the future of not producing carbon gases. Why would you have a market for that? Why would you have a market trading in not producing CO2 in the future? I mean, it's bizarre. It is what Marx quite rightly called a form of fetishism. In fact, this is just a rationale for having these markets alongside the continuation of producing carbon gases, but that's another issue. But my point here then is financialization, perhaps the key index of it, is the increase in financial assets to GDP by a ratio of 3. And that, sorry, to a ratio of 3, in fact by 3 times as well. And just to refer back to productivity that I did before, suppose when I was making this desk here, I used 3 times as many screws, 3 times as much plastic, 3 times as much metal. Right? Suppose I used 3 times as much inputs to make this table as I did 30 years ago. I mean, first of all, it would be pretty ugly in design. It might even be dysfunctional. I probably couldn't get my feet underneath it. It'd be too heavy to carry, etc., etc. So everyone would see this as productivity decline, using 3 times as much raw materials to make this thing than you did before. Surely that is productivity decline. Yet, to make this table, we now use 3 times as much financial assets as we did before. As the companies that are making it are engaged in speculative activities around the price of their raw materials, as those who own the companies speculate in. You get the idea? So the question is, why do we need, and what are the implications of there being 3 times as many financial inputs into making this table as there were 30 years ago? And I think it becomes very, very clear that what we've seen is this massive expansion of fictitious capital. Capital that has a claim on the surplus, but does not itself produce anything. And the way in which this financialization has taken place is what I call both extensive and intensive. The intensive is sort of fairly obvious. The intensive is this proliferation of different types of assets. You know, for me, for some people, financialization is the massive expansion of credit cards, mortgages, and so on. For me, that's not, I said I wasn't going to say differences about what financialization is, but here's one difference. Some people see it in terms of workers being exploited financially as well as in the production process because they've got mortgages on which they pay interest, they've got credit cards on which they pay interest, and so on. For me, that's not financialization. For me, financialization is the taking of those mortgages, the bundling them up into other assets, and selling them on as a set of assets to other people who will expect to make a profit, who will then actually bundle them up into another set of assets and sell them on in order to make profits, and so on. And similarly with credit, it's not credit cards, isn't financialization, it's the ownership of the credit, which is then sold on as another asset, bundled up into another set of assets, and sold on. I'll give you one example of this. Should I give you an example? Oh, that's the intensive exploitation, or the intensive process of financialization. The extensive process of financialization is the passage, the entry, the invasion, if you like, of finance into areas where it previously did not go. And this is the most obvious, well, actually mortgages were, in the UK, non-profit making business of building societies. So we have the wonderful example of Northern Rock, quite close here, aren't we? Of Northern Rock, which demutualized from being a building society, non-profit making organization in 1997, immediately went into speculation in mortgages in the United States with Lehman Brothers, went bust. The government provides £30 billion to bail it out. And my question is, why do that? Why not use the £30 billion to build I worked it out, it's either 20 or 200,000 houses directly? What is going on where we have to have these huge processes of speculative behavior in order to bring about housing finance? That itself is an example of the second type of the way in which financialization has progressed. Went on a bit here. And that is extensive, that is to say, moving into those areas where previously it didn't exist. And the most obvious examples of this are privatization and the education, welfare, and so on. Or, let me give you the example of water, something we're doing some work on at the moment. Water was privatized in the UK. What water do you have here? What's the water company here in Manchester? You don't pay any bills, do you? Who owns United Utilities? Basically, the water companies in the UK now are owned by a pyramid of financial companies ending up in the Cayman Islands. They're global utility companies. They use the secure revenues, which they know are going to come from water. They use the secure revenues in order to borrow, in order that they can speculate in other markets altogether. It's also to move tax around. But why do we want this bizarre financialization, this pyramidal structure going up through 8 levels into the Cayman Islands in order to supply our water? It's just nonsensical. Just nonsensical. Okay. So what I try to indicate here is the purchase, that's the right word, that Marxist political economy can have on the current crisis and the irresolvable recession. In this case, through appeal to Marx's theory of finance and how that relates to the accumulation of capital and the way, actually what I think is most important, the way in which financialization, the dedication of this accumulation of capital to fictitious capital, which is at the expense of high levels of productivity, real investment, efficacy, and so on. Okay, I'm going to finish now, or very soon. I'm not going to talk about, unless you ask me about it, I'm not going to talk about Marx on socialism and what happened in the Soviet Union and what's happening in China. You can ask me about that if you like. What I will end by doing is saying, why study Marxist political economy? And I thought of 3 reasons. First, is it enjoyable? Not really. I leave that to you to decide. Some people get into it and it's a hard slog and it has its moments. Is it interesting? I think the answer is yes. So if your interest corresponds with your enjoyment, that's great. Is it relevant? And I think the answer is yes. I do like to point to a huge debate. Whenever anything happens in the world, there is one set of people who says, this makes Marx even more relevant than it was in the past. It just shows how essential. And there's another group that says, this just shows how Marx's political economy is totally useless. We talk about the knowledge economy or the welfare state or post-industrial society or the end of the working class. Whereas, as I say, there's this wonderful tension in Marx's political economy between those who are for and those who are against about whether empirical developments do or do not make Marx more or less relevant. Obviously, I come down on the relevant side, and I've tried to illustrate that today. But let me finish with, it's a rather a long way for you to go, but if you go down to Highgate Cemetery and have a look at Marx's tomb, you'll see that written on his grave is something called the 11th thesis on Feuerbach, and that is philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. And this, you might think, and perhaps correctly, is a call to revolutionary action. Let's not sit here and philosophize about the nature of economics or even about the nature of Marxist political economy. Let's go out there and change it. Let's occupy the economics lecturers' rooms and say they've got to teach us something else or whatever. But that's one way of interpreting that thesis. The other way, which I think is very important, is that this is about, if we want to understand the world, Philosophers only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. If we want to understand the world, we have to think about what is necessary to bring about change, not how to make things remain as they are. So let me finish there for now.